And the goal of the work session is to have the town board receive information on topics of town business. And tonight we have lots of invited guests as well that are going to be involved in the conversation. Employees.
All right, Your Honor. So
Mr. Hale?
first, I think we'll just have the department heads kind of introduce their folks. So the first person is Terry Walker with Daniel. You guys want to come up?
Good evening, Mayor and Town Board. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Daniel Barolo. He comes to us from Estes Park as our new utility technician. His primary job will be doing all of the locates of all of our water and sewer and stormwater around town. So with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Okay.
Hello everyone, Daniel Barolo. I'm originally from California, born and raised, 21 years. Have a wife and 2 kids. My wife, she owns her own massage business and she also does property management, still in Estes Park. So we just recently moved to Loveland, so she's still doing a little driving here and there. At 21, I joined the military. I served 10 years in the Air Force as a military police. Early 2018, I got out, separated active duty, and joined the Colorado Air National Guard. So I'm currently doing that up in Greeley at the 233rd Space Group up there. The past 2 years, I was at the Estes Park Water Department doing mainline distribution and water treatment. So a lot of the stuff I'm doing here, I'm very familiar with, so I'm excited to be here and be a part of this team. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. First and foremost, thank you for your service, and then secondly, welcome aboard to Windsor.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mayor.
Looks like Eric, you've got a couple of folks, or a folk.
Hey, folks.
Thank you, Mayor and Board. It's my pleasure to introduce John Ward. He's a resident of Windsor for 14 years and has 4 kids, and he is now our newest park maintenance operator, mainly working in athletics.
It's ironic I'm working for Eric now and Bobby because I have 4 kids. Coached competitive baseball here, basketball for the last 10 years almost with both my boys. My daughter now is a coach for my girls in volleyball and basketball, so it's ironic that I'm working for the town, but also my kids are here playing sports as well. Just a side note, Eric and Bobby have done phenomenal jobs as a jewel in the crown of Windsor to have a rec department like you do. I know a lot of people from Loveland, Windsor, Greeley, Loveland, Greeley, and Fort Collins are here to play sports. You guys have done a phenomenal job for your rec department and parks department as well. Professionally, I attended both University of Wyoming and CSU. I worked for mostly in healthcare for my last almost 30 years. Worked for Banner Health and for Cheyenne Regional Medical Center, strategic planning, marketing planning, business development, and I actually worked with Bobby about 7 years ago to get the concussion education program going here at Windsor, as well as the first aid kits that are supplied for the health department as well. So, and also on the side, I'm a professional photographer. If I look familiar to some of you, I took your pictures when Patty was town clerk. And so the pictures you see on the website actually took those a while ago, so I'm a professional photographer on the side. But I'm really enjoyed to be working for you as all you have a great department for the rec department and parks, so I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay. Well, thank you for the time you spent volunteering with our kids in the program, and welcome to Windsor.
Thank you.
Okay, Chief.
I want to start the clock with these gentlemen. They'll be here for a while. No, this is normally not the normal way you like to meet the new employees, but we'll be honored to introduce Joseph Arnold White and Stephen Cohen. They're both new to the department. I think Mary swore them in. They're both great guys. I'm glad they're here. I'm going to let you tell them tell you a little about themselves. You have to watch Joseph, so he tends to talk a little bit longer than he should, so
Joseph Arnold White. I've lived in Northern Colorado for most of my life. Went in the military when I was 18 with the 82nd Airborne, 2 combat deployments, and then pretty much got back, decided to still live in Colorado. Got an animation degree, and then ended up driving a bus for the city of Fort Collins. Then kind of moved up through them and went to academy with them for police, and then transition over here. Just got hired on recently and really happy for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Stephen. So I was born and raised in North Glen, Colorado. Went to Front Range Community College, got my associate's degree in criminal justice, after which time I was hired on with the North Glen Police Department, who sent me to the Adams County Sheriff's Academy. Graduated there, ended up in Evans for the Evans Police Department, was there for 6.5 years. In that time, I actually scouted out Windsor once before, finally did it again, made the jump. Very happy to be here, very happy that I finally made the switch. It's a great town, great department, and I'm really excited to find the passion for law enforcement again. So, thank you.
Thank you for coming on board and being part of the Windsor family and for being willing to serve and protect. And to all of you, I wish you very long, successful careers here in Windsor. So thank you. So moving on then to our main topic this evening.
Those that are left.
Yeah. We're going to be talking about single-family dual-use residential water requirement. And Mr. John Thornhill, our Community Development Director, is going to lead the discussion. Mr. Thornhill.
That sure is a mouthful for a title. So what we're going to talk about today is just to kind of have a discussion around single-family residential dual use. It is our largest category and will be our largest category of water customers in the future. So we thought we would look at the current requirement as it is today and then look at what it might should be in the near future and just have a discussion around those things. We'll look at water demand, look at the history of water demand, shrink, our yield of our water supplies that are dedicated for the town. Talk a little bit about drought protection and how that plays into those decision-making processes, and then some cash in lieu effects as well that might affect our future policies regarding cash in lieu as well. So what is the current requirement? Section 13 dash.
Sorry. Are we supposed to have something on the overhead?
Oh yeah, I didn't even notice that was up there.
There we go. All right.
Go back here. Sorry about that. Got through those. So our current requirement is section 13-2-80, grant of water rights of the town municipal code states that all premises requesting original water service from the town shall furnish to the town without cost to the town water rights in the following amounts. And again, we're only talking about single-family dual-use systems. So those are systems that have a separate non-potable irrigation water source for the house. So we're really only talking about indoor use at this time. So currently that is at 0.25 acre feet per residence plus a 17% shrinkage factor, which results in a dedication requirement of 0.29 acre feet. The last time we looked at this was around 2015 or so, and I think the town at the time decided to leave it as it was set at that time. So here's current water demand. We looked back at, I think several people had looked at some analysis that we'd previously done from 2011 to 2015. We went back in and added on to that analysis the last 3 years. So we have 2011 through 2018. Took all of the customer water use data out of our utility billing system, came up with an average monthly use by year, and you can see that in the first column. And the second column is just that use for the entire year, so monthly use times 12 gives you yearly use. And then you look at the pre-shrink number in acre feet. So as you can see, that demand or the trend as water use going down since 2011. And then when we add in our 17% shrink, you can see that the average use now is 0.21 acre feet with shrink versus the 0.29 acre feet shrink that's in the municipal code.
John?
Yeah.
Mayor, may I?
Yes.
Thanks.
Mr. Slonsky.
I just, looking at this, John, I was curious, the locations roughly of these homes. How many homes are in this number?
Sure, there's about 3,000 accounts now that are dual-use system accounts in the town, actually about 3,400. And then we have 3,000 that are solely potable use accounts. So a little over half of our residential accounts now are in this category.
Thanks.
Okay. So you keep hearing me talk about shrink, and shrink refers to any losses within the supply or distribution system. You know, if you were to take that 1 gallon of water, for example, and scoop it out of the Colorado River and then put it in ditches and lakes and reservoirs and pipes and stuff and get it over to here, you're obviously not going to end up with a gallon of water. That's what shrink refers to. It's just losses within the distribution system to get that water to the tap. So that is a calculated number. It's not a number that we've made up or just plucked out of the sky, but we have to look at the required transfers from our agreements with our water treatment providers. Fort Collins Loveland Water District and the Northwell County Water District both charge a 10% shrink for water treatment. The city of Greeley, though, charges a 30% shrink because the Boyd treatment plant has a much higher shrink factor than the Bellevue treatment plant does. So we looked at the use at the tap, so this is at in the house, measured water use, and then the amount of water that would be required at the plant to treat that, and you come up with a 17% shrink. And the way we do that is we take the max amount of water from Greeley every year and the Fort Collins Loveland Water District. So those are basically like take or pay for us. Since we've paid for the treatment capacity, we want to maximize the treatment capacity out of that without having to go buy more from Northwell. So we maximize our use at those two treatment providers. And then whatever's left is being served by Northwell County Water District at the 10% shrink. Okay? And then when you calculate that shrink, you come up with an average of 17%. It is going down. It seems like the trend is slowly going down, but it's still at 17%.
Sorry, so again, when I look at that Greeley at 30%, you said that's they're requiring that much of an excess to cover shrink?
Yep, so we're required, so right now we've purchased around 651 acre feet of treatment capacity through plant investment fees with Greeley. In order to get that 651 acre feet, we have to add 30% to it, so we transfer 847 acre feet a year to get that 651 acre feet of treated water. And the reason is where that treatment plant's located. It's located on the Greeley Loveland irrigation system, and that's a historic ditch system that goes all the way from the west end of Loveland to the east end of Greeley. And if you think about that open ditch and those losses, you're putting that water in a big sandy ditch. And the way they set up that company was the first farmer on the ditch and the last farmer on the ditch would all pay the same shrink. So even though the first farmer in the first head gate, he might have only had a 2% shrink, but the guy at the end of the ditch probably had a 60% shrink. So they average that shrink out, and it takes about 22% more water to get the same delivery to both head gates, right? And when you change that water in quart and you're just taking it out of Boyd Lake and in the treatment plant, the company still charges that 22% shrink, that historic shrink, because you have to maintain that back to the river.
So the column with the calculated shrink at 17, 16%. Is that kind of the actual?
It's a weighted average of all three of those providers is how we come up with that 17% shrink. Yeah. And we pass that on to the dedication formula in the town. Does that answer your question, David?
Yes, thanks.
So the next step that we look at, so we have kind of like, we looked at the demand, we know what demand is today, and I took out a couple of just scenarios. So if you look at our current scenario, how we got to the 0.29 is use. We previously studied use back in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, when we were doing an agreement with a current developer in town. The use back then was 0.25. When we add the shrink in from our treatment providers, that's how we got to the 0.29. That's where we are today. If you look at, say, a hot, dry year like 2012 was, even though I'm talking about dual use systems here, the water use still went up for those accounts as well. So you can look at 2012, use was 0.21 acre feet, plus shrink, we get to 0.25 would be the requirement. Now again, the average, what I stated before, was 0.18 acre feet times 17%, that's 0.21. That's where we are today. And then if you look at 2018, it's all the way down to 0.16 if you just single that 1 year. And if you add the shrink into that, the dedication would be 0.19. So just to give you some example of different values for dedication. And then the next step is to not only look at, you need to look at both sides of the equation. So if we look at just the dedication amount, we also need to look at the yield of our water sources. And currently the town only looks at or accepts Colorado Big Thompson units and North Poudre Irrigation Company units. For each share of North Poudre that we acquire or have dedicated, 4 units of CBT comes with that share. And for all shares of CBT, the town currently gives a credit of 0.7 acre feet. So if we look at what we're doing today, so we know the dedication requirement today is 0.29. Let's see if I can get a pointer out here. So 0.29, and then our yield credit that we give on those CBT units is 0.27. So for every permit for a single family residential dual-use system, it requires 0.41 units of CBT to serve that house today. So that's what we're doing today. But if we were to start looking at maybe lowering that dedication value, to be more transparent, that's part of the problem sometimes we run into, that you don't look at these things for a while. Use is going down. Everybody's like, wait a minute, we don't use that much water. I ran a couple other scenarios in this matrix to look at how many units would be required if we lowered the dedication requirement to say 0.25 or 0.21. So if we stayed with our average yield of 0.7 but made it say 0.25, you'd only require 0.36 units of CBT for that dedication. And then again, planning yield. I don't know if you remember in our 2009 Water Master Plan, it recommended that we go to a planning yield for the credit that we give for CBT units. So a 0.6 quota instead of a 0.7 quota. And then if you look at the table, depending on where you set the dedication requirement, you can see the effect on the amount of units. Any questions? Anything to add to that? We might come back to that. So, and then, and just to show you what that effect is on yield for the town. So if we look at our water supplies, again, all we have currently is CBT units. So if we look at our average yield for our CBT units, which the average yield for the CBT system is 0.72 or something. The average quota is about 0.7. We have plenty of water. So it would look like that we're dedicating or we're asking for too much water in an average year because we're going to have excess water. Typically, I'll take that excess water and run it out to agriculture. So we support our agricultural community. And plus, we carry over as much as we can carry over in the CBT system for drought protection. What happens when you have a quota less than 0.7, a 0.6 or a 0.5? That's the planning yields and firm yields. And if you look at that firm yield column, there's not a lot of excess water even today. So our current demand level is 2,700 acre feet that we need to supply our residents, and we've only got about 2,900 acre feet in the account on a firm yield basis. So if we have another drought, we're kind of pretty close. It's about an 8% safety factor right now on a firm yield basis.
8%?
8%.
So how would you anticipate this chart dropping if we drop the requirement for?
If you only drop the requirement and didn't drop the yield, yeah, we would catch up to that 8% would disappear fairly quickly, I would think.
If I, kind of combination of this graph and the prior graph, it really asked the question, because obviously Northern Water is going to determine their ratio every year and it'll float around, average 0.72. If we have a wet year, and in fact they come out with 0.9, and we hold the units that are allocating 0.9, how much excess can we carry over? Can we store that for a number of years to come up and address a dry year?
It's a great question. So we can only carry over 20% of our ownership, right?
Okay.
Into the next year. You must use it all within the next year.
Okay.
So if we had 40% extra, we're only gonna carry over 20%. That other 20%, I'd either try to rent it all out to ag or somebody. And if we were unable to rent it out, for example, it would go into what they call the regional pool, and then they would bid on it later in the following spring and rent that water out.
So to put it another way, since we don't really have our own storage, if it's other than Northern Water and in their system, we just get that credit for 1 year.
Yeah.
So, with that 20% carryover, John would account for that first. So we would, account all that water, then we'd have the next year's, whatever Northern did the next year, to go from.
If
So-
by some chance you had a series of wet years, you'd carry over 20%, you wouldn't need it, but you'd burn that off first, you'd carry
Yeah,
over another 20.
Right, you have to use that carryover the following year.
Right.
You have to use it all first, and then you go into your quota water, and then we'd again carry
You'd be
over
able to
another
carry
20%. So we try to keep carrying that over every year. When I do the water supply forecast, I always account for that carryover water.
Sure. So in the prior graph where you're showing it, what happens if the yield is only is planning yield, for instance? Is that's not taking into account the 20% carryover quantity?
Yeah, the planning yield, in terms of the master plan, it did account for that. It said they're counting on a 50% quota plus the carryover to get to a 60% quota for a planning yield. It's kind of a wonky way of doing it, but
I was looking at this graph in materials because the same thing on yours where you're above the red line.
Yep.
You really can carry 20% to the
Right.
next year.
The problem is, if you look at this graph, you can see there are years where there's multiple years where you're below that 70% quota. So look at 2012, for example, the CBT system was set to be a supplemental supply. And that's how it's been run historically. So when you have a hot, dry year, normally you would think, oh, all the water rights aren't yielding, there's not going to be enough water. But if you look at 2012, for example, they issued 100% quota because they were making up for all those native water rights that did not yield. All right. But for Windsor, though, we can only carry over 20%. So even though we got 30% more than we need, we had a lot of excess water. So we really only probably needed 60% quota, but we got 40% more actually. We carry over 20% in the 2013, but then you only get a 60% quota because storage is now coming down into the system, right? So we could probably ride out the second year of the drought with enough water. We get our carryover plus 60% gets us up to 70%. But then it's the third year, so you look at 2014, you start to get really close to having to put on drought restrictions, for example, raise water rates to keep water use down. If you look at the 2000s drought, you can see that same pattern. The first year was 2000, really high quota, and then they started coming down, and then you enter into the drought. In that situation, the town of Windsor actually did have to go out and rent excess water. We did not have enough water to meet demand. So that's one of the reasons why you really would like to evaluate all your water supplies on a firm yield basis and not on an average basis.
So are you saying that in a severe drought, the 20% is not adequate enough for a multi-year carryover?
Yeah, if you got a long run on a drought, say 4, 5, 6 years, that carryover might only get us a couple years in, and then we don't even have enough supply to maximize the carryover. We're just barely meeting demand. And then if you hit that, and then you go into that next year, it's whatever the quota is. And if it's 50% or 60%, and you don't have that other 20%, then you're going to put restrictions on.
Okay.
John, did you say if we carried over 40% and we were able to rent out 20%, that keeps it out of the regional pool?
No, we can't. I think he's talking about in a normal year, like if we have 70%, if we have an average yield, we have excess water right now, so we have water that we can lease out agriculturally, but CBT only allows us to carry over 20% in any year, so 20 is our max that we can do. There's no 40%.
Yeah, so if you look at this graph here in the average yield column, it's probably around, a couple thousand more acre feet than we would need. Out of that 20% ownership carryover is about 800 acre feet right now that we can carry over. So anything, we would be renting, 1,200 acre feet or more out to ag in that situation that we couldn't carry over. Now, if you did, going back to your question, I think, David, is if we had our own storage bucket, we could carry over more water. But we would still have to use that water the next year so that we don't take the chance of spilling it on the east slope and not having a beneficial use for that water. But if we did have more storage, we would be able to increase our drought protection.
It feels like with our cap at 20%, the most we can carry over. If you go to an extreme in terms of the amount of water you're asking to have dedicated, so what? You at the time of dedication have all this excess water because you've used a firm yield allocation, and then great, but in reality you end up at plan and you have excess water because you got a dedication of more water, but you can only carry over 20% ever. I mean, imagine, take it to an extreme. Let's assume you had tons of excess water dedicated because you assumed the worst and planned for drought. But absent the drought, you're capped at 20%. So it feels like, it feels good to say we're going to get more to cover a drought scenario, but in fact, in reality, we can't. We can't because we're capped at 20% carryover.
You can if you get more units. So your 20% gets more, is higher.
You'll have more units.
So you have more units because you're collecting more units. But that's why you want to reevaluate that dedication policy a little bit more often, make sure you're asking for the right amount of water. And if you get all your water supplies being evaluated on a firm yield basis, then you can actually calculate and come up with what that safety factor would be or that drought factor would be and then not exceed it. If you start to increase and go over it, then you obviously alter your policies to stay within a reasonable amount of that drought policy. So for example, you set your safety factor at 15% or whatever of supply, and that will get you through a 6-year drought, for example, then that's how I would set it and not go over that. Because you're right, you don't want to have a whole bunch of water that you can never use.
Right.
If we were forced into putting some into the regional pool, are we compensated for that?
Yeah, you do get, Northern keeps a certain percentage of that rental fee, but we do get a check back for some of it. So to help cover assessments for the next year. Yeah. I try not to do that. I try to take it right down to the zero if I can, but sometimes you can't avoid it. You get a really wet year and, farmers will wait until the last minute to see if they need to rent the water or not, and then if they don't, then you're holding the bag with a whole bunch of water.
I think Mr. Baker has a question.
Why did you factor in on the shrink, the Fort Collins Loveland Water District? That doesn't serve what we're talking about, does it?
And our total water supply does, yes. So
water.
yeah, we're required to transfer all that water. So that's just looking at a total water supply.
Do they have any dual systems there, though?
I think they're considering some now, yeah, especially Fossil Ridge. I can't remember which one it is, but yeah. In the Windsor area.
Any other questions from, did you have anything further in your presentation that you?
I guess we talked about that. One other thing to talk about is kind of the cash and lieu effects too. Kind of threw this up here at the last minute today, but if you recall last year, we were looking at our rate models and on how to pay for NISP and stuff, and we've looked at the number of permits per year and the dedication requirement. That dedication requirement was still based on the fact that it would be 0.29 acre feet per permit. So Shane had me take a look at, for example, if we lowered it to 0.25, what would that do to our potential cash in lieu that would be coming in the future? If you remember, we talked about going to 100% cash in lieu system next year in order to pay for NISP. So we wouldn't be taking in any more wet water. It'd be 100% cash for raw water dedication. So if you look at it on just a permit basis, up here in the top, if we go from 0.9 to 0.25, it's about about $2,400 less, $2,300 less per permit. Now, if you take that out, these are the numbers that we actually put in our rate model. 330 some permits per year would be coming in on average. It's just an average number. The reduction in dedication by acre foot, and then I did the cash and lieu values, and then I inflated these 5% a year. Obviously, Water's been going up even higher than that per year, but I just did 5% for an example. And you can see by the year 2028, and this is the time period that we're trying to fund NISP as well, that we take in about $8.5 million less in cash and lien. So just something to talk about as well, effects of cash and lien.
Mayor?
Yes.
Yep. So, John, I guess when you look in particular at the planning to the firm, all the talk about a potential call on the Colorado River by the lower basin. Any update on what you're hearing there, and is there a chance that we'll get caught moving to plan yield at least because of that?
That's a good point to bring up. That's another risk factor. When we're looking at these firm yield values and these dedication values, you're really evaluating the amount of risk that you're willing to take when you go into that drought situation. Compact call is one of those risk factors. Thankfully, the amount of snow that the basin got, the Colorado River Basin got this last winter, kind of pushed that out a couple more years, but it's still there and it's still a concern that we should factor into our numbers.
And I just want to add a couple more thoughts. We've touched on them, but I think, the board, when we talked about our long-term water strategy, the board has really identified two kind of long-term goals for the town. One is to identify and acquire storage so the town isn't as hit by a drought. And the second one is directing staff to work with other local entities to see if we can lease water. So that way, if we do have a drought issue come up and we are at that firm yield, we still have water and we're not in a drastic situation. So I just want to let the board know that those are still, the storage isn't progressing as much, but certainly we have talked to some other local governments about leasing water and getting those agreements in place. So when those are there, I think we would look at the drought contingency a little bit different. It's just without having those in place right now, we are, a little bit at risk without those.
But those two things contingent upon what would happen, but if either of those came to fruition, would definitely change this scenario somewhat as to what we're looking at. Because I think there are a couple of positives here, right? I mean, on the whole, most of our folks apparently are using less water, which is kind of an overall goal, I think, that we've had in terms of our conservation programs and different things like that. And there's more efficiencies out there in the marketplace now and all of those. So at the same time, though, while we're doing that, I think we have to understand, we have a lot of folks in the audience here who represent our development community, that, again, it's that fine balance, too, because, I mean, should we make those same requirements for them that we've always seen, or do we need to, and that's what we're looking at tonight, right? Is there room to do some kind of readjustment? So I am going to allow, I mean, because this is a conversation and we've invited these folks, if they want to step forward and have additional questions to bring forth too. If you have something else that you'd want to share or let the board know as consideration as part of this conversation, raise your hand and I'll call you up as well as the board too, as soon as if the board has finished asking any questions they have.
Mr. Thornhill looked like he had some other comment.
I was just going to add one other thing kind of to what the mayor is talking about, though. We have done an awesome job of reducing water use by having dual use systems, so the amount of treated water use has gone significantly down per person in Windsor, but that also hardens the demand. And when we talk about demand hardening, it's the amount of water that you might have available during an extended drought period. We can't rely on cutting back water use on lawns, for example, and it's really hard to go into the home and cut back water use there if that's the only place you have water being treated. So there is kind of a, we got to weigh both ends of that discussion. And as we move forward and add, double the amount of dual use system accounts that we have in the town, we really are hardening our system a little bit. So you got to take that into account with your drought factor or your drought response as well. So.
I just have one quick question, John.
Sure.
When was this 0.25 and 0.29? How long ago was that number set?
So I believe it was around the early 2000s.
And then, Okay, and then going forward, how often do you think we should revisit the numbers regardless of what we do tonight?
You know, it is steadily dropping, it looks like, but you gotta remember too, the last few years have been a relatively good period for moisture, especially during the irrigation season. Now, we are talking dual use systems, so it shouldn't affect those accounts as much. But if you look at that 2012 year though, people did obviously hook up to the potable system in their house and watered bushes, trees, whatever they had to do. But I think I monitor it all the time because I'm entering the data, and I assume that whoever my replacement is will be doing the same. So we'll probably be looking at it fairly often, and if we start to see a significant drop again, we would obviously bring that back to the board. But yeah, we'll be looking at it every year.
Yeah.
Do you envision it ever going back up for any reason? It seems
You
like our
know-
systems are getting better, so it doesn't seem like it would.
Yeah, I mean, I made the one comment in the memo, if you noted that, if for example, if you start to accept other water supplies that maybe have a higher shrink value overall, it could go up depending on where they're gonna be treated. For example, if you start accepting a lot more Grade 11 water in the system, you're gonna pay that higher 30% shrink. There's just no way to get around it. So you could see that average weighted shrink come up a little bit.
As our composition changes.
Yeah, as our composition changes, but, overall, I would hope that it would still continue to go down. A lot of aging infrastructure is being replaced, efficiencies are being improved, so it should at least stay the same or go down.
But would it make sense as one of our future strategies to actually look at accepting water supplies and looking at and going after those water supplies that have less shrinkage capacity
Correct.
from the very beginning?
Correct, yeah. So if we were to look at future demands, I'd be looking up at that Bellevue side, more on the Pooter. And those.
I mean, that should maybe be part of the consideration when we're looking at what we're going to put into our water portfolio instead. I mean, I think to date, we've kind of needed to put almost anything and everything we could get our hands on, right? And we want to be somewhat diversified too, so we aren't dependent just to one entity. But at the same time, in the future, I think in order to strategize and to ensure that we can avoid a long-term drought situation and other things, it might be prudent for us to really look at the partners that are out there and kind of be a little bit more, I guess, picky about who we're picking and choosing to partner with. Yes.
I guess just a quick observation before, I guess, we get other comments, but I'm just kind of finding it hard to completely ignore your first table where you're really doing the actual calculations of the, looking at the 0.18 plus 0.21 with the shrinkage. I mean, that's hard data. That's a real number. And it seems like, how do you ignore that as a starting point in saying what's fair and what's supported by the data? Now, when you go to the yield and you think about working off of average versus planning, I think there is enough stress and risk right now in Colorado River that maybe you move to planning. But I have a hard time. I would have a hard time justifying anything above 0.21 in terms of your, the amount of dedication. I did agree.
Is this the graph in front of us? Is that, it looks like you're looking at something different on your screen. Is it the one before
the very
that?
first graph in your presentation where
Well, that's the total demand, but the average he's talking about is the third row on this
the
graph.
2011 to 2018
Yeah.
average. But it feels like when we look at our ordinance that says, it's kind of a firm number that just says we're going to do 0.25 plus yield 0.29, but we're ignoring in that case where the water's coming from.
Right.
And it feels like if in fact we've got 30%, 10%, 10%, maybe the ordinance needs to be a little more detailed in saying your dedication and your loss calculation is different depending on what you're dedicating. And because it seems different, well, because when you average it, somewhere.
Right. Yeah, and that's the problem with using the averages.
Yeah.
You got to pick a number. Picking, you could pick the average to the 0.21, and if your water supply evaluation was also on a firm yield basis, I'd be comfortable with that, right? If the firm yield was used. But what happens when that 2012 year comes back though? So you're cutting it so close, right? You're just getting enough supply because that's the amount of units you took in for that average demand. But what happens when that demand year goes up? Because it will go up.
Yeah, you almost need to advance the slide, John, to get to the next one.
I think it's actually.
Well, no, it would be that one, because this kind of brings all three in.
Right.
Right, right. I understand.
Because if we stayed at that average yield at 0.7, but we lowered it to 0.21, we would no longer have any drought protection. And that 8% that I showed you would just disappear. Because remember, we're also talking about moving to 100% cash and lieu. So we're not taking in any more wet water. That amount of units that are going up and that 20% you could carry over is not going to grow.
Well,
So you're
and,
really
and I just
hardening
add that the only way, though, that we can successfully do the 100% cash in lieu is if we're able to lease water, because if we have a drought, we don't have any excess water to lease out, or we can't sell into that unless we have water we've leased. You know, because if we have a drought year, we just don't have that excess to sell. So that's part of the water strategy, again, with the board, is that the only way we can really switch to 100% cash in lieu is if we've negotiated some leases. So when we hit that drought year, we have the water.
I don't know, I gotta go, and actually go backward 2 slides, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, one more, sorry. I mean, this is the one where, those are accurate, those are firm data, you know, they're real numbers. And it comes out on average to a 0.21. So yes, you're right, if you don't have much protection on a drought year, but in fact, the most recent number is 0.19. Right. So you really have you know, a little bit of a cushion there between the averages itself creating a cushion. I guess it's hard for me to quantify what that means in terms of a cushion, but if you use a 0.21 average and then used your planning yield,
I think that's a valid point, and that's a discussion for the board to have and the town to have, as to the amount of risk that you're willing to take. You know, and if you look at that, you know, they are becoming more efficient. You know, you're getting better fixtures every day. That's a valid discussion point.
Does what you have here take into consideration NISP and the 3,300 acre feet that we would acquire from that project if and when that comes online? Or is that, when that happens, do those numbers readjust all of this?
NISP is already evaluated on a firm yield basis, so the amount of water that Windsor has committed to purchasing is on a firm yield basis, the 3,300 acre feet. So it's just whatever you set the dedication at. So once we know that supply is going to come, we'll add it into our supply calculations and stuff. But that's part of the reason why you should really evaluate your whole water portfolio on a firm yield basis, so you don't have these separate.
But will it potentially change some of these numbers, because that's
Well, it depends on where you treat it and the amount of shrink.
Yeah, because that's water that's coming that to date doesn't have any end purpose yet dedicated, right?
I mean,
Except potentially.
Yeah, so I guess I should have defined firm yield a little bit. Firm, when we talk about firm yield, that includes all the losses and stuff. So that's the yield that you're gonna get on the water. So like that 22% did shrink for a GLIC yield, for example, that's included in the firm yield. You've already paid all your return flow obligations, the water's been shrunk. That's how much water you can expect to get out of that water right. Okay? Same with NISP. Now, the number might change, you know, once we get further down the road and figure out where all the stuff's gonna go. But you really want to evaluate your entire water supply on a firm yield basis.
Yes, just to reiterate, and I know I said it, but I'd be curious your thoughts if in fact our ordinance had more of a, where the shrink is different, varies depending on the source of the water being dedicated.
I think that would be fine. Yeah, depending on where that water rate comes from. Yeah.
Okay.
John, could you also send us that last chart? You didn't get the chance to.
Oh, yeah,
put in
I'll
the
send that to
packet,
you. Yep.
You know,
Cash
the
in lieu.
cumulative
Yep.
cash
Yeah.
in lieu.
Yeah, I can send that to you.
Anything else from board members? Is there anybody who's here this evening as one of the guests who had either a question or additional comments that you wanted to add to the conversation?
Hi, good evening. Martin Lind, I'm with Water Valley. First of all, I applaud you for tackling this issue. No pun intended, but it's a fluid discussion that goes on with this water thing. And also would like to applaud you for the hire you have in John, because, you know, quite frankly, Windsor's not had the tools of the knowledge of people like John and all the history he had with Greeley. And also, you're not cutting edge here tonight. Every single water district, every single city, I spoke with Roy Otto and Greeley today, and they're going through this entire same process because the commodity value of water has got everybody's attention. And so everybody is doing what you're doing proactively to make sure that fairness is instilled and that there isn't this cushion that you can't ever use. And so anyway, but just by pure virtue of what's going on in the world right now, UBC codes are requiring lower flow shower heads, lower flow toilets. And, you know, quite frankly, in Windsor, we have an oddity. We never really had a very high dense development anywhere. So as the address, the consumption per address comes down, some of that, we're going to see that continue to accelerate because we're starting to get more multifamily, more apartments, which we never, you know, Windsor was really historically just a little single family community. So I think John touched on it briefly too, that there's two trend lines that are going on. One is the consumptive use of inside the house, and the other one is the actual shrink that's happening. And I know for our companies, we don't touch a ditch that was an old historical sandy leaky ditch without putting it in RCP pipe, and so you're seeing that happen all through the Front Range. Is the shrinks are becoming, you know, and that's a pretty slow process, but it is happening. Is the shrink in the actual physical delivery of those old historical ditch systems is getting far superior than it was. And you know, I know our companies have probably put in, without exaggerating, 10 miles of RCP pipe and to enhance, and quite frankly, you don't want the liability of an open ditch through your developments anyway. So, but a little bit of this too, and John can give you far more data on this, but the CBT project is the benchmark in Colorado. I mean, that's the gold standard. But the CBT project is actually for those spike years when we have a drought. So bear with me a second, because I don't have the knowledge that John does, but I have an awful lot of knowledge from being a farmer for a lot of years. But when the CBT, like 202, CBT board reconvened, it was a historic drought. They reconvened and they reallocated. So really in the drought years, your CBT yield it's the reverse. Am I right, John?
Yeah, it's higher.
Yeah. So where you're looking at the firm yield or any of those, since Windsor's entire portfolio is CBT, if we were to get into catastrophic drought, that board's fiduciary duty, the very fundamentals of that board, is to deliver more East Coast water, or Eastern Plains water, right, John? West slope water to the eastern slope. So since you're so heavily invested in CBT, you have if we get into that catastrophic situation, that board has historically, and it's the founding basis of that company, was to deliver water from the west side over to us. So I feel comfortable that you're in a really good position in a drought year. And then also the last thing is along with studying this and making sure that you're accurate, it is just math. You know, it's just math. There's no gray area in this. It's math, and that's what we're applauding you for looking at this tonight. And you know, water is a commodity. In California, they were going through biblical, historical droughts the last couple of years, and now there's so much water the dams are breaking again. But during that extreme period, you know, those cities and those counties dealt with it as a commodity. And if they couldn't get a certain community to adhere to conservation, they would just start turning the dials on the cost of that water. And so one of the things that is odd, and I don't have the chart right here, but one of the spike year where the consumptive use went up.
2012.
There we go. So the spike year in 2012 where it went up, I can assure you, there was nobody in the developments that we developed ran out to their outside spigot and hooked a garden hose to it for two reasons. Number one, even in 2002, our lakes, our storage reservoirs and our historical rights, we had completely full lakes through the drought year of 2002 and obviously 12. But the cost of that, I mean, if they were going to hook a hose up to the domestic supply, if you will, their water bill just goes through the roof. So in our developments, our systems are reliable. People would never do it. It's against our code. You're not even allowed to have a spigot on the outside of the house. But if you're not allowed to irrigate anything, if you're just looking at your cost per water, it's less than half if you're irrigating with the raw system. So that spike in 2012 really confuses me, and I don't know, John, if you have.
And Martin, that's not the town spike, that's CBT. So the Northern Board, it was a drought year, and they did 100% quota. So that's not town data.
I'm on the wrong one. I saw a
But
spike.
demand did spike in 2012.
It's almost page one.
Yeah.
It's
I'm sorry, it may be not that one. But anyway, one of them
Keep
had
going back.
backwards this way?
Yeah. Keep going. Keep going.
I'm up there.
Right there.
Okay,
Yeah,
there,
you
that's
see
the one, I'm sorry, I thought it was
2012.
graph. But that's where that consumptive use actually went up. It didn't follow the trend line. I don't know what that would have been. It seemed like an anomaly. So, because I know it wasn't from our developments, because nobody would do that. Nobody would go use expensive water to irrigate when they had plenty of the discounted ag water. But again, I applaud you. I think you have great people bringing you great tools to make good decisions, and look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, John Turner. I spoke in front of Kelly Arnold that set up a meeting. Dennis Wagner was there, Water and Sewer Board, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. It was over at the rec center, and we kind of discussed some of these ideas. And it was ironic because Bertha had the same type of meeting at the same time. And our whole goal was to get off CBT. You guys are, if you think there's a future, you guys are the trustees looking out for the town. The future of CBT is dead. There is no future. You gotta get off CBT. Bertha did. They went out and bought some Windy Gap, 20,000 an acre foot. They had one of the worst policies in northern Colorado. Now they have one of the best. And I got projects from Meade to Berthoud to Loveland to Fort Collins to Windsor to Severance. And so I'm looking at all these different things. And you guys have a nice policy. You guys are advancing. Your problem is you're on it's like a train going off one of those cliffs where you keep seeing the trains keep going off, and that's the future of CBT. And you have to, you're basing this whole model on that, but you're not looking at the supplies. You have other supplies. There's things you can do. We discussed this, I don't know how many years ago. And there's good tools in the toolbox. You guys aren't a little town anymore. You should be looking after your future, making, I looked at the Water and Sewer Board at that time. I go, the first good start here is to get rid of the Water and Sewer Board, because it was just like, they're stuck. Great, you have gold. You have gold bars sitting in your water bank. Terrific, but your future is nothing. You can get on other water. You can diversify. You can start a water bank. You can do other things. You just look at the map of Windsor. You've got Windsor Reservoir right up there. You could create a water bank. You could do something. The policy you're continuing. And I have projects still in Windsor, but they're not on Windsor water. So I actually have, my last project was Windshire. So I don't even have a project dependent on your water, because it's not so much, some of your water policy is very good, but your future for the town is I've told anybody probably the last 5 years, if you are CBT dependent, your future is dead. Dacono, Firestone, Frederick, Windsor, Timnath. We're just going to take North Poudre and CBT. That thinking is old thinking. Your future is dead. You have to do something different. You're trying to be more efficient and you're trying to squeeze the last bit of moisture out of the sponge. You got to find another source of water. Windsor Reservoir, Windy Gap, something different. And a lot of people are depending on this. Great. I hope you guys get this. I would love it if you came up with other ideas. Let our metro districts do some stuff. There's some water that we can't get, or that our metro districts can't get. But your creativity on a 1 to 10 is basically a 1. You guys are not advancing the future, protecting your future interests. There's projects in this town that are dead. They won't go because the water requirements are too great, and they're key pieces of property would stop other potential property. You got to think differently. Everybody knew this 10 years ago. I went out and bought a ton of CBT in 2008. I couldn't hold it. Everybody knows it. But you guys are chasing the wrong supply source. Your whole policy was based on CBT. That whole presentation of CBT, that's dead. There's no future here, guys. So you got to do some. A lot of people are starting water banks so that water doesn't leave our basin. And these are ideas that are. I mean, the Windsor Reservoir is a tremendous water supply. 4 miles away, and no one's using that water. I know North Wells looking at it. You got to start thinking differently than what you're doing. So I'm encouraging you to do a water bank. Loveland's water bank is okay. I think Greeley's water bank is better. Berthoud's trying to do it with some handy. What was really interesting is Berthoud didn't do what I asked him to do, but they made a strong move. It was pretty creative because I go, you guys got to grab this handy water. Well, instead of saying, okay, we'll grab handy, they said we'll take handy, but we'll give it a terrible yield. I thought they'd drive the price of handy through the roof, and they have, but it wasn't Berthoud's fault. It was Little Thompson's fault. So you have, as everybody indicated, everybody's trying to do what you guys are doing, but I see the biggest flaw in your model is you're spending so much time looking at CBT. And that's fine. You get an extra percentage here or 2%. That's not solving anybody's future. I don't even know if NIFS will ever get approved. Some people are very optimistic. How long have we heard 3 years? How long do you think? 3 to 5 years. Have you heard a different number than 3 to 5 years for the last 10 years or 15 years? Yeah, so that just seems like a carrot that just keeps moving away from you guys. So,
John, so if I heard you, well, my understanding, and I'm relatively new, most of the water inventory that the town holds primarily came from either dedication or cash in lieu, mostly dedication. And so if you, from what I'm hearing you say, in order to not be CBT dependent, if we were asking for dedicated water, we should be asking you to dedicate anything but CBT. And so what would you do then?
Okay, but you can do trades. I'm not going to sit here and show cards, but you guys have the yield on CBT is terrible, especially for its cost. There's nothing worse in northern Colorado. Is there anything even close to as bad as CBT?
Not cost.
No, so you keep trading in the worst yielding, most expensive water that every other town in northern Colorado wants. Everybody else wants that stuff. It just hit record prices. I don't even want to say because it'll probably bump the price at the town. But you keep looking at the wrong. That's not a solution. Is to say, let's get a little here. Those are great ideas. I got a couple other comments that I'll wrap up because I don't want to. Fort Collins Loveland just did a study on the non-plots in Fort Collins in their district, and most of them are my project, and most of them are in Highland Meadows or at Highland Meadows Golf Course, and they looked at 330 units, and it was pretty funny. They couldn't figure out why there were 0 readings on some month, and it was snowbirds. So they actually took a worse scenario. They only analyzed the homes where they had 12 months of reading. And they came up, they had an exact number. It was, there was a little buffer, it was 45,000 gallons for a non-pot house. So that's significantly lower, because I believe these are non-pot houses, right?
51,000.
Now, I kind of know some of the mistakes that have been made in the town. I'm sure Martin knows too. Like one of the worst, it was in the Beacon a decade ago, and it showed one of the worst, the most water users in the town. And it showed the school districts, the schools, and then it showed Windsor as their parks or something. The next one was 5 or 6 of our homeowners at Windsor Estates, which was one of my second project, and they were supposed to do a non-pot, and these homeowners were watering 2.5 acre lots with potable water. So the top 10 users, half of them were homeowners at Windsor Estates. I mean, it was just the dumbest thing going, and I'm just sitting there going, gosh, that's so embarrassing. That's embarrassing for us, it's embarrassing for the developer, so that type of thinking's antiquated. What was so interesting was the non-pot houses with developer installed irrigation systems were at 0.31 acre feet, or 45,000 gallons. And that wasn't even a fair number because it didn't take into account the snowbirds. So that was lower than the multifamily consumptive rate. And we're going, how in the world could the patio homes with non-pots be lower than the consumptive use of a multifamily? Couldn't figure that out yet. So we're trying to figure out some of those reasons why that's going. So the non-pot system and Windsor requires them when they're there. I'm just thinking that with Windsor Reservoir, water supply and storage, Windy Gap, you guys should take some of your CBT or some of your capital, maybe even joint venture with the metro districts, and go get some other water. And you should start a water bank. You shouldn't let the Windsor Reservoir go away because it's such a high yielding water, and it's in your backyard, and it's right there, and no one's grabbing it. I think Northweld is talking about grabbing it. Is Northweld taking Windsor Reservoir? I don't think they are yet. But there is, I think Greeley's looking at it too. It's a tremendous water resource right in your backyard. There's different ways to figure this out, but you gotta get off CBT. CBT is dead, so.
John,
Sure.
And either John could answer this. If we were to stay with our current water treatment people, Fort Collins, Loveland, Northweld, Greeley, how easy is it to get other water into those plants besides CBT water?
Nothing's easy anymore. It's all hard work. It's getting good dry ups, but everybody's doing it. If Little Berthoud can go do a court case on Handy, then Big Windsor can certainly do it on Windsor Reservoir. You guys have far more knowledge and capital and resources, and if Berthoud can figure it out, Windsor can figure it out. But the future of CBT, it's a brick wall. There is no future. That game is over. So you guys all have a straw and a Slurpee cup, and there's 20 straws, and there's nothing left. And your whole policy, I'm sorry, that's a way. I'm trying to say something that has some impact. Everything he showed you should be forgotten, and you should look at new resources. And right now you've gone after NISP, and that's great. I hope you get NISP, but NISP is no guarantee.
I think we get your point, John.
Okay. I'm trying to be respectful but effective.
Thank you.
I was going to.
Anybody else?
How you felt about CBT?
Good evening, everyone. Pat McMeekin, Hartford Homes. Thank you for inviting me tonight. So thank you, Scott Balstead, wherever you're at. I'll be quick. The only thing, I think everything you're talking about tonight is fantastic and what needs to be done. The only additional item I'd ask you to look into more is dedication rates based on single family product type. So they're very different from a single family detached home to a condo to senior living. They're all very different water uses based on how those types of products live with people. So I would ask you to explore some of those different product types and maybe look at different dedication rates based on those product types. I think you could look to your friends in Elko, the Elko district. They just did a study and have tiered dedication rates now based on product type. So I think it makes a big difference and certainly worth looking into as you're studying things. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks. Is there anybody else in the development community? Okay. So I guess board members, how would you like to move forward? I mean, we have to give some direction. And I guess I would ask, you know, is there a way that we could better, I mean, based on everything that I've heard, can we better diversify and rethink our supply to protect against future drought and also the consideration of water acquisition? And so so that's not an answer, but I guess what it means is I think maybe taking all these comments and thoughts, and is there a place, John, for you to now go and continue to go down this path and think this through a little bit more, or did you kind of think that all the information you presented here was kind of the end all?
Well, this was more on the dedication side of
Okay.
things. We are doing those other things concurrently, so we are looking at, you know, our water master plan 10 years ago, like John said, identified other sources of supply that we could deliver. We're currently looking at getting those dedicated, diversifying our portfolio. NISP is a big part of that right now. The town has been in that project since the beginning, and we're still continuing to do that. Hopefully that comes to fruition, but we are looking at Larimer Wild. We are looking at water supply and storage shares, Big Windsor, Windsor Reservoir Canal Company, Newcash, all those things, even local ditch companies within Windsor to offset some of our future augmentation and return flow obligations. So we are looking at all those things, and as we get those things, we'll bring them to you.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I have a thought. Yeah, there's also a bunch of numbers here. We looked at, you know, the current number of 0.9. I'm using the numbers with the shrinkage built in. And, you know, that maybe is too high, maybe in some cases, you know, maybe deemed unfair by our development community. Then if we look at actual usage over the last 8 years of 0.21, you know, dropping down by 7 points is probably way too risky. So if we were going to fall somewhere in between, I guess how do we get there? How do we determine what level of risk we're willing to take, as well as being fair to the development community?
Yeah, I mean, that, you know, part of, we did put some money in the budget next year to do a drought management plan, so it would, that could be part of this, where we would look into that. You could change the dedication amount before then, but that would look at the whole picture. It would look at all the water supplies we currently have, potential future sources of supply, storage. You can always add storage into this component too. If you really want to improve your drought protection, you really need a storage component with it, separate from the dedication amount. Dedication is dedication, like Pat said and John said. You know, use is going to be the use, and it is going down. So you should try to be transparent with that, what you set that dedication value to, and then you tie your supply into what your demand is going to be in the future.
Right. Well, and I know we have currently a lot of additional water conversations happening. You know, we've got a lot of, I know our town manager's having lots of conversations with potential collaborations. We've got a leadership group that's going to be talking about some water conversations, including bringing in the counties. So do you have a suggestion, Mr. Hale, on how we might move forward? Because I'm not sure that, I mean,
right.
I'm not hearing that, I mean, that we're prepared to just
do
move
something right now.
one way or the other
That's
at this
right.
point.
I think like most government meetings, we've agreed to have another meeting. I think that is, I mean, honestly, you know, because I know that you guys have heard a lot from the development community. I know that we put a lot at you. I think it is worthwhile to discuss. Right now for 0.25 and 0.29 with the shrink, does that number warrant going down? You know, and I think I've heard enough from the board to say, hey, that probably bears at least further discussion. But we just want to be able to kind of take that risk adversity and put it in there and say, how much risk do we take? And, you know, really what's fair, how much of the municipal risk should we be passing on to the development community? We say if there's a drought, we're at risk here, you know, how much of that should be borne by private? How much should be more incumbent upon the town to develop that storage and develop these other agreements and address that? So, you know, I think that it is worthwhile to discuss a lower dedication amount. But yeah, I wouldn't want the board to just throw a dart and hit that tonight. I think that
Right.
this probably, we can run a little bit more analysis from staff side and at least give those kind of risk scenarios to the board.
Absolutely. It's an important conversation, and I think, you know, what we choose to do now sets precedent and affects future generations. And at the same time, you have developers out there who at the same time have to have some kind of certainty and assurance as to what we're doing. I don't know that, you know, I mean, at least somewhat, right, as to where the future is going to go in terms of what we're doing as well. So I think that the conversation would be better had vetted out a little bit more so that we get it right in the next go round. And we do have, you know, somebody who's, I think, very authorized and experienced to kind of, you know, lead us in that direction with your experience, John, and where you come from, that I think that hopefully that and this conversation with all these other folks, they probably will be sending you other documentation and materials for consideration, that we can take that all into account and have a conversation, and in that next conversation come out with maybe a solid direction of where we want to go. Does that sound?
Yeah, it's a lot to absorb right now. So
Right.
I think, and we need more, so.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Sosowski?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I just wanted, it seems to me, despite Mr. Turner's comments on the larger picture, what was before us tonight really was looking at our ordinance and our dedication policy, and does that need to change? And I think, Mr. Wilson, your comment on the, you know, point 2.21, I think, in my case, I was hedging that by going to planning yield instead of the average yield. So you're kind of creating a buffer there. But I think the 2 points about possibly having shrink, the ordinance having shrink different depending on the water dedicated, but also I think Mr. McMeekin's comment makes sense too. Maybe we need to look at the type of single-family housing category and have this be a more robust. I'm struggling with, of course, and I'll turn to Mr. McCarter, and how much detail you want to get into the ordinance, or do you just leave yourself saying see table A that'll be published, you know, year to year. But I think I'd ask John and Shane in the town to consider that single family variance type as well as different different shrink. Thanks.
Okay, does that give you at least some direction as to what our expectation would be in the next meeting? Okay. Our final item this evening in the work session is future town board meetings. So we do have a special meeting for September 11, 2019 at 6 p.m. It is the joint meeting with the Downtown Development Authority. We'll meet up here. We will call both boards to order, and then we will have a call to go into an executive session. So that will happen on the 11th. And then next Monday, we do start our work session early at 3 o'clock over at Public Works Facility. Is that the time? Do we need to come earlier than that if we want to tour? And how much earlier? Like more like
Yes,
2:30?
Mayor, I think 2 o'clock would be great because, I mean, probably 35, 45 minutes will be enough for the tour, but I just want to make sure we get a chance to get everybody around, answer any questions you have, and then get everybody oriented and settled. So I'll send out another reminder in the weekly update, but basically 2 o'clock. If you plan on attending that, if you could email me or let me know, because I wouldn't want to start the tour without you, but we'll kind of know who to expect. So we'll plan on 2. And then I'll talk to Eric again. If he thinks we can get away with maybe squeezing that to 2:15, I'll put that in the note. But right now, kind of plan on 2 o'clock.
Question for you really quick.
Yes.
Wednesday night's meeting, are we going to have any public comment like we did the last time, or it's straight into the executive
It's just
session? Okay, I was just
executive
curious
session.
because, yeah.
So we're not asking for any presentation from Brinkman. I think we've heard from them and we know their program and what that is. This is just one more chance, I think, for Matt Ashby and I to update the board on all the discussions we've had with Brinkman since that executive session.
Okay.
Because I think that it behooves everybody to just kind of have a final decision. Are we going to move forward or not?
Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to point out, or anybody need to point out about future meetings at this point in time?
No, Mayor.
Okay, if not, we're going to move out of the work session, but then I'm going to move right into our Kern Board regular meeting, and I'm going to call the Kern Board regular meeting to order for September 9th, 2019 at 6:56 p.m.